Our first question is, could you please introduce yourself and explain why you are a candidate for the Oakland School Board?
Great, thank you. And thank you too, and thank you OEA for my first endorsement interview of 2022. For me, this has been a long time coming to be in this position. I'm a proud graduate of Oakland Public Schools. After graduating from Oakland Public Schools, I worked with youth and in our schools for 20 to 25 years. And I was second generation. My mom was a kindergarten teacher in Oakland for over 40 years, a former first vice president of OEA. My father worked 20 years in Peralta in the TV and media department. And even my younger brother taught for 5 or 6 years in Oakland before going on to be a lawyer. And so this has always been kind of our family business. And in 2012, the two schools I had worked at for 10 years, Santa Fe Elementary and Maxwell Park Elementary, were both slated for closure and then closed. And during the process of that year, I got very involved in trying to stop those closures. I wound up losing my job because of the organizing I was doing against the school closures. And when our schools were closed, I quickly realized I needed to shift my focus away from providing direct services to youth and really fighting these bigger systemic issues to keep our schools open. It took me 8 years and 3 elections to finally win and get onto the school board. And in 2020, we were able to put together a coalition of progressives, labor, and education justice warriors to really not just win my election, but sweep elections across Oakland. I'm really excited about this upcoming election because we have a job or a chance to finish the job. We've done a really good job of breaking through, and with these victories in November, we can finally flip the board and have a solid working majority going forward.
Thank you very much for that answer. Next, what current programs or proposals do you feel are successful? What would you keep and build on, and what would you cut?
So I'm going to be a little difficult with this question because I think it's a little bit too broad. And so some of the things that I'm really excited about is bringing a new school redesign model, sustainable community schools, which has been adopted across the country. And we have a really huge opening to get that instituted as our new school redesign model. And other cities across the country have used that as school redesign, so school closures and privatization would no longer be considered. I'm also excited because last year, the school board passed a new strategic plan. I was the school board point person for that strategic plan. And in that role, I scrubbed the strategic plan of any mention of charter schools or school closures. And we centered Black and Brown students and community schools within that. So I think we are poised to really move forward. I also did a lot of work before my election and then during my first year and a half for safe, equitable reopening of our schools during this COVID pandemic, which has really made us take kind of a side route to some of the improvements we were looking to make in the district because we had to address this pandemic first. But I think now we've kind of stabilized a lot of the things in the district. And so before we move forward, I think what's really important is that we launch a district-wide envisioning process. One of the mistakes that we've made as a district too many times is we've thrown out the old plan and just immediately tried to roll out the new plan without really engaging the community, allowing folks to weigh in and getting that important buy-in. And so before I would lay out my full prescriptions of what I think, and I definitely have some ideas, I think it's really important that we create a process and restore the trust so the community can weigh in. Then whatever plans we come up with, there will be buy-in across the board and it'll make implementation a lot smoother going forward.
Well, thank you very much. Our next question is, will you commit to rejecting donations and support from privatization-linked organizations such as Go Public Schools and the California Charter School Association?
Yes. And more than that, I would seriously doubt that any of those organizations would ever endorse me or give me any sort of funding for my campaign. I'm really proud of the fact of what we were all able to put together in 2020, where as a community, we rejected those outside dollars coming in to our elections. I ran for 3 times for school board in District 5, and combined, I had $1 million spent against me by most of these forces, which is insane for a local school board race here in Oakland. But we have stood up to that, we have pushed back, and we've established that you don't have to take those dollars in order to be successful in our local elections. And I think we've started to see the payoff now going forward, where we now have a district that is no longer oriented towards go and charter schools and bending over backwards. And charter schools and privatization is really in retreat now in OUSD. And so these things have big implications because who is funding candidates does matter. And if people are willing to accept those dollars from those candidates, they're willing to listen to them, entertain their ideas, and a lot of times advocate for them. And so the last part of it that we need to get a little better at as a community is understanding some of the subtleties or some of the subtle differences between folks who are in favor of privatization and folks who are in favor of closing schools, because it's not always the same groups of people. So hopefully going through this cycle, we can even help the community understand better some of the subtle differences. So we, again, raise the understanding in the community, because that's what's carried us forward. Once the community understood what this money represents, the community over time has been rejecting it more and more often. But I will never take dollars from those sorts of forces and people who support those policies.
Okay, and what is the role of the school board? What is the role of an individual school board director? And what should the relationship between the board and the superintendent be?
Well, again, this is a very broad question. So to narrow it down, the school board's role is the school board has fiduciary responsibility over the district. The school board is in charge of the district's finances. That's where the buck stops. The school board also directs the superintendent through policy, through resolutions, and then the superintendent is supposed to implement those policies. And so we can see, for example, I was able to get a resolution passed last year that I co-authored that calls for setting a little over $20 million aside to pay off the state loan early. That resolution passed unanimously. We have that money set aside and ready to go, and we just now need one more school board vote to implement paying off the loan early. That's a real tangible example of how the school board can direct policy through a resolution that then the superintendent needs to implement. We even see it now with the school closure plan in a negative sense. The school board voted on January 19th to direct the superintendent to produce a list of schools to be closed, and then that's what the superintendent did. And so that all came from a school board resolution. I think it's really important. And also as a school board director, my number one job is to represent my constituents in the community that elected me. And whether that's representing them directly or bringing them into the process or just being their voice within the process, that's the number one role. I think it's really important also that individual school board directors have a good relationship with the superintendent. For example, it's my conversations with the superintendent that got me appointed the school board point person for the strategic plan, which allowed me to scrub some of the language that was in that strategic plan. And so it really is built on that relationship, but the school board needs to always be the ones directing the superintendent through our policies.
Wonderful, thank you. Our fifth question, do you commit to voting against any school closures? And other than school closures, what are 3 specific ways you can respond to possible funding shortfalls in the budget?
So yes, fighting school closures is my number one issue. One of my biggest successes of my first year and a half on the board is we were able to end the blueprint process because I worked directly with senior district staff And really, we outmaneuvered everyone else, where the other 6 school board directors did not even understand what they were voting on with that resolution, where we voted on budget adjustments to finally end the blueprint. That was key, and that was historic, and that was lined up and in the works by the Lame Duck School Board in December before I came into office. So my number one job when I was first sworn in was to make sure I ended cohort 3 and the blueprint process. And with not a lot of votes, I was successful in being able to do that, which then produced this new school closure plan. And I would be remiss if I skipped over the fact that if we elect the right school board in November, the school board that is sworn in January can rescind all of these school closures that are lined up for next year. That's why it's so important that we kind of do the right thing and win these elections, because it is all or nothing now for these school closures. I don't buy that closing schools improves the district's finances at all. And I don't buy that that's what's been driving these issues of school closures. OUSD is not in financial crisis. OUSD is now projecting a surplus this year and surpluses our next 2 future years. We have not been in this situation in 20 years. And so we are not in financial crisis. I've worked really hard to stabilize the finances. We've got all of these new dollars coming in. So we don't have to ask that question anymore. What do we need to do to solve this financial crisis, school closures, or something else? Going forward, it is all just about budget approval and budget reprioritization. And again, there is no financial crisis.
Okay, thank you. What do you see as the effects of charter schools on OUSD students, and what do you believe should be the relationship between OUSD and the charter sector?
So charter schools have had a big impact on OUSD, especially since for a long time we had the highest rate of charter schools in the state of California. We've been able to already turn the corner on that. And so passing Assembly Bill 1505 was a really big step for us as a state. And I'm proud of the work I was able to do to help get that passed. But since I've been on the school board, the number of charter schools and charter school enrollment in OUSD is down roughly 10%. In the 2 years I've been through the Prop 39 cycle on the board has signed zero new Prop 39 leases. And I'm the chair of the Charter Matters Committee. And by the end of June, the school board will be approving a new board policy on charter schools that starts off something to the effect of, since we are not actively seeking charter schools, please refer all requests to our chief academic officer. So we've done this work within the district. We also passed a enrollment stabilization plan, which was basically removing some of these other aspects of charter schools out of OUSD. I do not believe that charter schools are public schools. And I do not believe that charter schools should have any access to OUSD. At best, our public schools are in competition with charter schools, and we need to treat it that way. So I'm really happy with the course and the direction we're going now. Like I said before, there's no mention of charter schools in our strategic plan. And we have done a really good job in a year and a half of kind of unwinding the tentacles of charter schools that were all through the district. So there's still work to be done. And the last thing, just real quickly, is the governor called for a moratorium on renewals for 2 years. That moratorium is up next year. So all of this has happened. We haven't even had a chance to do a yearly renewal process, which again will allow us to start closing the lowest performing charter schools so we can get to a manageable number.
All right, thank you. Next question is, could you describe some examples and sources of environmental racism in your district and say how they have affected OUSD students, parents, and educators? What commitments can you make toward combating the disproportionate impacts of pollutant exposure on OUSD students, parents, and educators?
So this is a very tough issue because unfortunately OUSD does not have control of all the environmental factors going on around us. And so environmental racism is like all of the structural racism, where it really creeps into every community and every aspect of life. So for example, in District 5, we have always had a huge problem with lead, going back to all the lead that was in the paint. It's in our soil in a lot of schools in District 5. It is a huge systemic problem, but it's really hard for us to address as a school district. And so when lead came up being tested in some of our water and faucets at some schools, I was really disappointed that the district didn't take a more aggressive approach to at least check those environmental factors. And of course, if those schools were in different neighborhoods, it would have been addressed differently because there would have been a different sort of demand. But it's hard for us to address all of this as a district. So I think a better example that I have for how it's being addressed is actually not in District 5, but when we look at McClymonds High. McClymonds has had these long systemic issues. The lead in the water was first brought up at McClymonds. We had the CTE chemical leak seeping up through the soil, like what was found then in Deep East Oakland afterwards. And nothing seemed to be getting done for McClymonds. What we've been able to do now is McClymonds is set for a rebuild, like what has happened at Fremont High. And although all the money hasn't been approved yet, I've been able to push district staff to front load what has been approved. So there's enough funding now to get through this first year of planning and architectural plans. And then hopefully the board can prioritize more of the Measure Y spending at the front end to see that project through. So really what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to look to address this through our construction and how we manage our sites to try to abate some of this environmental racism that's out there. And just as a side note, one of the added benefits of us having air purifiers in every classroom as our response to the COVID pandemic is that does ease some of these environmental factors that have been present the whole time. So if we can build off of that, if we're looking at replacing HVACs, but not just for COVID, but for this larger plan of addressing these systemic issues, we can really start moving this forward. And hopefully as some of these new facilities dollars and infrastructure dollars keep flowing from the state and federal government, we as a community can really dedicate them to addressing these issues.
All right, thank you. And how would you partner with the Oakland community, that is students, families, educators, classified staff, unions, community organizations, et cetera, around issues facing our schools, in particular when making controversial or difficult decisions?
Well, that's always going to be I don't want to say a difficult spot, but that's a spot where I can never do enough. And so it has been, I must say one negative thing, it has been a little frustrating serving my term during a pandemic because we don't have those same face-to-face meetings. I haven't been able to be as present at the school sites as I would have envisioned or I would like to be. So it is definitely a work in progress. And I like to think I set a pretty high bar for myself, but I come from the community. I've been working in the community around these specific issues for over 10 years, and I know everyone. And so I'm really proud of how I've maintained the platform that I ran on, and I've fought for those issues, and I've been consistent. And so like when we saw the school closures issues come up this year, I did everything I could do to inform the community, to be present in the community at viewing parties, to encourage people to participate. I met with all of the schools under threat with groups of their parents and really just trying to organize so we're all together. And so making sure that I am the voice of my community like I was elected to be. There's also a bunch of other things I've been able to do. Some folks at Manzanita Seed had issues with their site administrator. I stepped in and helped find relief there. I've met with students and staff and parents at Met West to try to provide support for the issues going on there. We had the school board viewing party at Manzanita Community. Those are the things that I'd like to be able to grow off of. But we have not been able, the one place that I want to be able to do better is because of the pandemic, we have not been able to institute the real community engagements, either from the whole school board or me as a director. And so that's definitely, as it becomes safer to do it, a part that I really want to ramp up going forward. And it's just hard not having staff. There's only one of me. And so this is one of the things that I always feel is kind of a limiting factor to what I can get done.
Thank you. And our final question is, and before you start answering, I'm going to do a little clarifier, is would you like to make any closing remarks? And do you have any questions for us? And what I would say, which I said to the last person, so I'm going to say it to you as well, I would say use the 2 minutes on the closing remarks, because I don't know if we're planning to put the questions for us on YouTube. And so I don't plan on timing those.
It's fine. I asked my questions at the start, so I'm good. So yes, in closing, you know, this has been an amazing year and a half for me that I've been on the school board. I am in this position because so many people worked so hard to help me get here. And I hope and I feel like I've lived up to those expectations. But we have so much more work to do. And I think now that I've proven that I can get stuff done on a school board, even with nowhere near a working majority, that this is the time to really double down and build off of that. You know, when I ran in 2020, not only was I endorsed by OEA and got a unanimous endorsement from Rep Council, I was endorsed by all of OUSD's bargaining units, the Central Labor Council, Democratic Party, DSA, Green Party, really across the board. And we were able to bring this coalition together, which allowed me to be a serving school board director with a strong, demonstrable base. And we are in a very, very strong position right now. You know, me being redistricted and my whole neighborhood from the place that I've lived for 40 years, I actually think provides an opportunity for us to really expand our strength and grow stronger. I showed that I can beat the charter forces even when being outspent. A large part of my district is still the same, so I've established that I can win in this district. And I'm hopeful that folks can join in and support, and we can sweep all 3 of these elections. If we can sweep these 3 elections in November, I'll be elected board president in January. And my first action will be to rescind and overturn the school closures. My second action will be to institute sustainable community schools as our redesign model. And we are off and running with a visioning process to really rebuild this district. We are so close to finally flipping the board and getting back local control after 20 years. And so I'm just hopeful that we as a community don't back away from these successes, but we really embrace it and double down. It is all or nothing for this election. Either we have almost 10 schools slated to be closed next year, or we're going to elect a board that will immediately overturn this decision. That's what's at stake in this election. And hopefully, again, we can kind of get the band back together. And, you know, there's a lot of personal stuff that happens in Oakland. I understand. But for me, this is about winning and getting our school district finally back under community control for the first time since 2003 when we were taken over. And that's really the message. And I will figure out how to run as an incumbent, but that's also where it's different for me, because now I've sat in the seat and, you know, 2 years ago, I was hopeful and guessing on what the role would be. And I can really state a lot of these things now for certainty, where I know how to move us forward. And together, we can finally build the schools that we know our community deserves.